Have you ever felt that a thought of yours seemed to echo in someone else before a single word was spoken? Science calls this quantum entanglement. Particles that, even when separated by vast distances, share the same state as if they were one. But beyond physics, this phenomenon invites us to reflect on an invisible web that sustains every human encounter and every intimate perception that cannot be explained solely through ordinary logic. Think of two strings tuned to the same note. Strike one, and the other vibrates even in silence. It is in this kind of resonance that the spiritual dimension of entanglement begins to reveal itself. It is not only about electrons or photons in a laboratory, but about the way our consciousnesses seem intertwined, suggesting that separation may be nothing more than appearance. To sense this subtle field, close your eyes for a few seconds and recall someone with whom you share a strong bond. Notice if any sensation arises in the body, a warmth, a tightening, or a lightness. This is the kind of inner data that matters to us, immediate records that do not depend on blind faith, but on direct perception. The goal here is not to provide definitive answers, but to propose an experience, to look at quantum entanglement not only as a scientific concept, but as a practical metaphor for spiritual life. Each step of the journey ahead seeks to make this connection more tangible, translated into daily observations, into signs that can be measured within consciousness itself. This opening is the invitation to investigate together what it means to live in a reality where nothing is truly separate. When speaking of entanglement, it is common to think of laboratories and sophisticated experiments. But the most transformative understanding arises when we realize that this phenomenon can be read as a language that runs through our own daily experience. Two particles in correlated states do not need to exchange conventional signals to be linked. They already carry within themselves the mark of a shared unity. This idea becomes even more intriguing when applied to the human field. Bonds that withstand time, connections that seem to survive distance, and even the lack of rational explanations for encounters that change our path. What stands out is the possibility that life is structured upon a web of invisible relationships, sustaining events we call coincidence or synchronicity. The scientific term may sound technical, but at its core it describes something very close to what we experience in moments of heightened perception. A glance caught in the crowd, a phrase that arrives as the exact answer to a private doubt, an intuition that comes true. In each case, the mind tries to find linear causes, but something broader seems to operate in parallel. Physicists describe entanglement as a rupture in the classical view that everything works in isolation. It is as if the universe were reminding us that absolute separation is only a practical convention, not an ultimate truth. When we transfer this logic to inner life, an invitation arises to reconsider how we see ourselves in relation to others. We are not islands surrounded by invisible walls, but part of the same fabric that vibrates according to the movements of each thread. This understanding can be tested in a simple way. Close your eyes and bring to mind someone with whom you have a significant bond. Allow the body to register any sensation. Perhaps a memory awakens warmth in the chest, perhaps a subtle contraction in the throat, or even a gentle expansion that seems to open space inside. Mentally note this sensation without judging it. This small gesture works as a personal experiment because it makes clear that bonds are not just abstract memories, but states inscribed physically within us. It is at this point that the spiritual dimension enters. Entanglement invites us to perceive radical interdependence. It is not about thinking everything is connected as a generic phrase, but about noticing in detail how each gesture reverberates beyond what the eyes can capture. The tone of voice used in a conversation can change another's mood for the entire day. An act of care may resonate weeks later, altering future decisions we may never know about. This network of repercussions, almost invisible, is the everyday form of entanglement manifesting itself. One challenge here is recognizing our own filters. Often when interpreting coincidences or signs, we project expectations, reinforcing narratives we wish to believe. This is the trap of inner bias, forcing connections in everything without distinguishing between real correlation and imagination fed by desire. Questioning ourselves before each perception is an essential part of the process. Asking, is what I feel now direct data or interpretation that fits what I already wanted, creates room for a more honest practice, where spirituality is not reduced to illusions, but becomes a constant exercise in lucid attention. When we observe entanglement as a practical metaphor, we can also see how it dialogues with concrete choices. Think of a decision made impulsively, changing jobs, ending a relationship, accepting an unexpected invitation. Many of these choices seem to arise from within, yet they often carry echoes of something transmitted to us without words, from invisible bonds influencing the path. This perspective does not take away our autonomy, but reveals that free will coexists with a web of silent influences. This invisible thread between 2 points does not need to be regarded as mysticism. On the contrary, it can be observed as part of an inner laboratory, recording signs, verifying sensations, questioning personal narratives, and above all, acting on a small scale. The simple act of calling someone at the moment a persistent thought arises is already a way to test this web. Many times the response we receive confirms that something indeed moved on the same frequency. Other times nothing remarkable happens, and then we learn to deal with the boundary between desire and real data. Entanglement, when translated into human experience, does not require complex formulas. It presents itself in gestures, in the synchronicity of encounters, and in the way the body reacts to invisible bonds. The spiritual emerges precisely in the space where reason admits it cannot account for everything, yet still opens to observe without haste. The thread that unites 2 points, visible only in its effect, is also the opportunity to live with greater sensitivity to the impact we leave on each other. Entanglement is often described as an anomaly in classical physics, an exception to the rule that everything requires direct contact to communicate. However, this anomaly can be seen as a reminder that reality is broader than linear logic suggests. If particles can behave as a single system even at a distance, perhaps our emotional and spiritual experiences follow the same grammar. They do not depend solely on physical proximity, but on a shared field that remains active, even in silence. A simple example is found in music. Strike a note on a well-tuned piano and notice how certain strings of nearby instruments vibrate in response, without anyone touching them. The sound awakens in them an invisible movement, created by resonance. This image helps us think about human connections. There are encounters in which we feel someone reverberate within us, as if a note played outside found intimate correspondence inside our body. This spontaneous response does not need words, only presence. To make this idea more concrete, try a small exercise now. Close your eyes and recall a moment when you were near someone with whom you feel genuine affinity. Bring that memory as if it were an inner photograph. Then notice if any reaction arises in the body, perhaps relief in breathing, perhaps expansion in the chest, or even a light tingling. These sensations are not abstract symbols, they are immediate data, markers that a memory is recorded not only in the mind, but in the whole organism. This kind of record is a way of accessing the language of entanglement applied to everyday life. Spirituality enters this scenario as a lens that magnifies what is already happening. It is not about adding artificial beliefs, but about paying attention to reverberations that escape rational thought. Many intuitions, for instance, do not arise as mysterious voices, but as subtle changes in the body. Sudden tension in the shoulders before a difficult conversation, a chill in the stomach before a risky choice, or unexpected relaxation when approaching someone trustworthy. The language of resonances is not limited to concepts. It is written in sensations, and it is up to us to learn to listen to them without hurry. At this point, it is important to bring in a bias check. Often, we project expectations onto inner perceptions, creating stories that serve more to confirm our desires than to observe reality. That is why before each sensation, ask yourself, is this direct data from the body, or just interpretation that fits the story I want to believe? This simple question works as a filter. It does not eliminate the mystery, but prevents it from being reduced to fantasy. Entanglement, as a spiritual metaphor, reveals that to live is to participate in a network where each action echoes in multiple directions. A word spoken at the right moment, can ease the weight of someone we did not even know was suffering. A thoughtless gesture can generate unexpected consequences that ripple in invisible circles. The point is not to control every reverberation, but to cultivate awareness that they exist and that we participate in them with every choice. Also consider how this perception changes the way we make decisions. If each movement connects to a wider web, our choices cease to be merely individual and become part of a collective dance. Deciding to listen to someone instead of ignoring them, to offer attention instead of rushing, to care for tone of voice instead of reacting on impulse, each micro-decision changes the pattern of strings around us. It is a way of living in which responsibility does not mean burden, but recognition of the power we have to influence the collective symphony. This perspective may seem abstract until it is tested on a small scale. A simple practice is to write down a sense of synchronicity or an encounter that felt meaningful. Describe what happened, how the body reacted, and what thoughts arose. Then return to the record days later and see if it still makes sense or if it was only projection. This revisiting allows us to distinguish consistent data from fleeting interpretations, creating a personal method of observation. Over time, this habit trains sensitivity to perceive real connections without getting lost in fantasies. The language of subtle resonances, in the end, is less about extraordinary phenomena and more about refined attention. Quantum entanglement gives us the scientific image. Life offers the practical laboratory. Between the two, a spirituality emerges that does not depend on dogma, but on direct experience. It manifests itself in the body that reacts before the mind even formulates explanations, in the word that resonates beyond the moment it was spoken, in the invisible bond that sustains improbable encounters. Learning to read this language is learning to inhabit a reality where nothing is completely isolated, and where each gesture participates in a greater music. Entanglement is often described in physics as a paradox that challenges classical notions of space and time. To a mind accustomed to linear logic, the idea that two distant particles could react in a coordinated way seems almost impossible. Yet this phenomenon has been proven by countless experiments, suggesting that reality may be grounded in principles of connection that do not rely on our usual forms of communication. When we bring this perspective into everyday human life, a fertile ground opens to understand differently the bonds we cultivate, the unexpected encounters, and even the decisions we make without knowing where they came from. In spiritual practice, this notion does not appear as an abstract theory, but as direct experience. Many describe feeling connected to loved ones even miles away, or receiving subtle signals in the body just before significant news. It is easy to reduce such perceptions to coincidence, but their consistent repetition suggests that there may be a shared field of information, similar to quantum entanglement, in which our consciousness participates silently. A useful exercise to test this idea is to pay attention to the body during ordinary days. In the course of a conversation, for example, notice if there are sudden variations in internal temperature, changes in breathing, or shifts in posture that were not expected. Often these reactions happen even before the mind formulates a rational explanation. Recording these signs makes it possible to identify patterns. Perhaps whenever a certain person approaches, an unexpected lightness arises, or perhaps certain situations bring physical contractions that serve as warnings. These observations do not need to be interpreted immediately. It is enough to acknowledge them as data. Science reminds us that entanglement does not imply the transmission of conventional signals. It is not about sending instant messages, but about sharing a common state that transcends distance. This subtlety is valuable in the spiritual field because it helps us realize that deep connections do not require constant conscious effort. They are simply there, sustained by a kind of invisible field. The practice, then, is less about creating bonds and more about learning to notice the ones that already exist. But there is an important challenge, distinguishing between genuine perception and mental projection. Often, in search of meaning, we may turn any coincidence into proof of connection, reinforcing narratives that do not correspond to reality. This is where bias checking becomes indispensable. Asking oneself, am I observing real data or fitting an event into the story I want to believe, creates a space of honesty. This practice does not annul spirituality. On the contrary, it gives it consistency. Without this care, the risk is turning the beauty of entanglement into superstition or self-deception. Think of how this understanding can impact concrete choices. Imagine someone who repeatedly feels an impulse to reconnect with a distant person. Without reflection, they might dismiss this sensation as nostalgia. But if they choose to record, observe, and then act carefully, they may discover that the other person had also been thinking about that reunion. In this case, it is not objective proof of entanglement, but a meaningful experience that shows how bonds remain alive on levels that Cartesian logic does not fully explain. The shared field is not limited to personal relationships. It also manifests in collective environments. Anyone who has been at a concert, a ceremony, or even an intense meeting knows the feeling that everyone seems to be breathing in sync. This experience cannot be reduced simply to the sum of individuals. A collective vibration emerges, as if the entire group were a single organism. Entanglement provides a scientific metaphor for this sensation, reminding us that reality is not made only of independent parts, but of patterns that form in the union of elements. This perspective inspires a less individualistic spiritual practice. Instead of thinking only about our own development, we begin to realize that each gesture has repercussions in the network of which we are part. Choosing patience in a moment of tension can generate waves that extend beyond the immediate scene. The silence of a conscious breath can change the rhythm of an entire conversation. This understanding does not translate into moralism, but into lucid responsibility, recognizing that we live within fields of mutual influence and that each micro-action shapes this field. In the end, quantum entanglement does not need to be seen as a distant or inaccessible metaphor. It manifests itself as a living language, inscribed in bodies, in encounters, and in collective environments. Spirituality gains depth when we accept to investigate this language honestly, without rushing for definitive answers, but with openness to perceive the subtleties that weave our relationships. Between science and personal experience, what emerges is an invitation to recognize that reality may be more of a vibrant network than a collection of isolated pieces. Much of the fascination with quantum entanglement comes from the fact that it reveals connections that do not pass through traditional communication channels. This same principle can be applied to how we perceive inner life. Many answers do not arrive through logic, but through discrete signals the body transmits before any mental elaboration. The human organism, in this sense, functions as an antenna attuned to subtle frequencies, picking up nuances of a relational field that we cannot see, but we can feel. Think of everyday situations in which the body reacted before the mind understood. A sudden chill that arises in the room just before someone announces difficult news, or the breath that loosens when we enter a welcoming environment. These movements are not mere physiological accidents. They can be understood as bodily translations of information circulating on a broader plane. Entanglement offers a lens to observe these phenomena not as mysticism, but as clues that we are embedded in a system of invisible interconnections. To make this more tangible, try a brief practice. Close your eyes, inhale slowly, and without forcing interpretations, notice which part of the body most calls for attention at this moment. It may be a contraction in the stomach, warmth in the shoulders, or heaviness on the forehead. Just name this sensation internally, without trying to change it. Then ask, what recent situation might have left this mark on me? This simple inquiry helps reveal how external events are inscribed physically in us, showing that body and environment are not absolutely separate. Spirituality, in this context, ceases to be an abstract exercise and becomes a practice of somatic listening. By noticing the signals, we are not seeking immediate explanations, but cultivating sensitivity to perceive how each encounter reverberates within us. This process broadens awareness of the invisible network we participate in, revealing that connection with others is felt before it is rationalized. However, a necessary caution exists. Not every bodily sensation indicates a profound truth. Many times, our emotional habits condition the body to react predictably in common situations. A person who grew up in environments of constant criticism may feel tension whenever someone raises their voice, even without real threat. This is the moment when we need to question, does what I am feeling now correspond to this context, or am I carrying old patterns that repeat? This checking helps distinguish between authentic perceptions and echoes of the past. The body as antenna also teaches us about reciprocity. Just as we perceive reverberations coming from the world, we also emit signals that affect others. The tone of our words, the way we sit in a room, the rhythm of our breathing during a conversation, all of this transmits messages that go beyond verbal content. Entanglement, in this sense, is not only something we receive, it is also what we radiate, consciously or unconsciously, into the relational fabric. This awareness invites small, practical changes. One example is adjusting the rhythm of breathing in tense situations. Breathing more calmly and deeply can alter not only the internal state, but also influence the atmosphere around us. Likewise, offering full presence to someone, without interruptions or distractions, creates a field where the other feels deeply heard. These micro-actions reveal that the body is not only a receiver, but an active part of the web of human entanglement. Another interesting dimension is noticing how collective environments intensify this antenna. Being in a group in harmony can generate sensations of expansion and belonging that hardly arise in isolation. This experience is common in artistic practices, rituals, or even in situations of shared silence. The body vibrates in unison with others, showing that there is a layer of communication that does not depend on words, but on joint presence. Entanglement provides a powerful scientific metaphor to understand why these moments seem to transcend the sum of the parts. From this understanding, cultivating attention to the body becomes a form of applied spirituality. It is not necessary to wait for extraordinary events to perceive invisible connections. It is enough to recognize the chill in the stomach before an important decision, the relief after an aligned choice, or the energy that grows next to someone with whom there is true affinity. These experiences compose a living map, recording how life inscribes itself in us at every moment. In essence, the body as antenna reminds us that we are made of the same matter that vibrates throughout the cosmos. Each sensation is a piece of data in this great network of resonances. Learning to listen to these messages does not mean getting lost in fanciful interpretations, but embracing the reality that connection is a fundamental aspect of existence. Entanglement ceases to be just a scientific concept and becomes everyday experience, felt in the rhythm of breath, in unexpected shivers, and in the silent presence that binds us to one another. Quantum entanglement, in its most intriguing aspect, shows that particles can share a common state even when separated by vast distances. This feature invites us to reconsider episodes of synchronicity in our lives, those moments when external events seem to reflect precisely what is happening within us. It is not merely a matter of statistical coincidence, but something that touches a deeper level of meaning, as if reality were responding in tune with our inner movements. These episodes become particularly striking when they appear during phases of decision or transition. It is as if an apparently mundane detail came bearing a message. Someone might think of a childhood friend, and on the same day receive an unexpected message from that person. Or they might be reflecting on a professional change, and upon opening a book at random, find a sentence that speaks directly to their doubts. The rational mind tends to reduce these occurrences to probability, but the subjective impact they cause suggests a broader resonance, a kind of silent dialogue between us and the invisible fabric of the world. From a spiritual point of view, these synchronicities function as mirrors. They do not tell us what we should do, but reveal the inner state we are in. An external event that gains symbolic weight shows our consciousness's readiness to recognize patterns. The phenomenon is not only out there, but is born from the meeting between event and interpretation. This detail is crucial. It is not the world that sends us coded messages. It is we who, in certain moments of openness, perceive connections that would normally go unnoticed. A practical way to deal with this is to cultivate an investigative outlook. Whenever a synchronicity arises, instead of accepting it as an absolute sign, ask yourself, what does this event awaken in me? The value does not lie in predicting the future, but in accessing present data that were invisible. This stance prevents us from falling into the trap of seeing omens in everything, while allowing us to make use of the symbolic richness of these events as tools for self-knowledge. It is also important to consider that synchronicities only come to life when we are attentive. Those who live in a hurried manner tend not to notice reality's subtle fittings. Spiritual practice here becomes an exercise in pausing and listening. By slowing down, we make space to notice the sentence that appears in a casual conversation, the gesture of a stranger that seems to answer an intimate question, or even the insistent repetition of the same symbol in different contexts. Each detail serves as an invitation to investigate the larger web of which we are a part. The connection between synchronicity and entanglement need not be taken literally, but as an inspiring metaphor. Just as entangled particles share invisible states, we too may live in relational fields where information circulates subtly. By noticing these manifestations, we gain the chance to act with greater awareness, turning seemingly random events into opportunities for reflection. This way of living does not eliminate rationality, but complements it. We continue making plans, using logic and assessing risks, but we also make room for signs that arise outside predictions. In some cases, these signs offer unexpected clarity, showing that life may be more responsive than we suppose. They remind us that we are not isolated in our choices, but connected to a larger network of resonances. The challenge lies in balancing fascination and critique. Fascination, so we do not lose sensitivity in the face of the unexpected. Critique, so we do not turn any coincidence into a magical answer. This combination places us in a posture of constant learning, where each synchronicity is welcomed as valuable data, but not as absolute truth. It is in this balance that spirituality becomes a living practice, rooted in experience and open to the complexity of existence. Now, if reflecting on these connections has already stirred in you some recent memory of synchronicity, how about recording it right here? Write in the comments what the most striking episode you experienced was, the one in which life seemed to respond in a surprising way to what you were feeling or thinking. Sharing these stories helps expand the collective field of perception and can inspire others to recognize their own signs. And if this content brought value, like the video so that this network of resonances can continue to grow and strengthen. Thinking of quantum entanglement as a metaphor for practical life leads us to consider how our choices are inscribed in a larger field of relationships. In physics, two entangled particles respond jointly, even when separated. In daily life, our decisions echo beyond the individual sphere, affecting environments, bonds, and even people we do not know directly. This recognition opens space for a new form of responsibility, not the heavy obligation to control everything, but the lucid awareness that every gesture is part of a broad, living network. Consider moments of doubt in which the rational mind proves insufficient. Many choices seem to surpass the traditional logic of pros and cons. An invitation accepted without hesitation can change professional paths. A casual encounter can redefine an effective trajectory. These are situations in which we feel we are responding not only to rational data, but to something greater that runs through us. Entanglement serves as an image for this kind of decision that seems connected to invisible threads, reminding us that we do not choose alone. Our choices are influenced by subtle patterns that escape objective calculation. The body, again, is the first source of information in this process. Before formalizing a decision, it reacts. Lighter breathing in the face of one possibility, muscular contraction in the face of another, or even an unexpected surge of energy when we think of a particular option. These signals are not infallible, but they function as complementary data. Listening to them does not replace reasoning, but broadens the field of evaluation. It is as if we were reading not only the mind's logic, but also the organism's response to what is at stake. To make this point more concrete, try recalling an important choice in your life. Ask yourself what bodily signals accompanied that decision. Perhaps a weight lifted, giving a sense of openness, or on the contrary, perhaps a discomfort persisted despite all the rational justifications. Observing these records retrospectively helps us train perception for future choices, creating a repertoire of internal signals that serve as silent guides. This perception also broadens the notion of time. Often, decisions made in the present reveal their repercussions only months or years later. An apparently banal conversation can generate unexpected opportunities. An act of care towards someone can return in surprising ways in another context. This unfolding shows that our choices participate in a network of connections far more extensive than we can see. Entanglement reminds us that, just as distant particles react together, our decisions may be intertwined with invisible consequences that are revealed only later. It is natural, in the face of this view, to feel tempted to seek absolute certainty before acting. However, entanglement itself points to the impossibility of total control. Life is made of interdependencies and uncertainties. The invitation is not to become paralyzed, but to learn to deal with ambiguity creatively. Instead of waiting for guarantees, we can open ourselves to the partial clarity that arises in the body, in the context, and in subtle signs. This clarity does not eliminate uncertainty, but provides enough support to take the next step. Here, the importance of bias checking also becomes clear. In delicate decisions, it is common to confuse desires with authentic perceptions. A strong longing for a particular option can lead us to interpret bodily signals selectively, confirming only what we already want to believe. Recognizing this tendency and asking, "Am I seeing real data or merely reinforcing my preference?" is an exercise in honesty that preserves the integrity of the practice. By understanding decisions as a reflection of the invisible web, spirituality gains immediate application. We are not talking about abstract rules, but observable practices. Listening to the body, recording sensations, questioning interpretations, and above all, acting even without total certainties. This way of living reduces anxiety because it shifts the focus from control to trust in broader relational processes. It is not about passivity, but about active participation in a field of resonances of which we are a part. Entanglement, in this sense, is not only an inspiring metaphor, but a method of perception. It invites us to live attentive to the invisible repercussions of our choices, reminding us that each decision is also a message sent to the network of connections that sustains us. This awareness does not make life predictable, but more alive, where each step carries the possibility of reverberating in directions we do not yet know. Speaking of entanglement in spiritual terms may sound grand, but its greater strength may lie precisely in how it manifests in simple day-to-day situations. The scientific concept describes particles that share invisible states. Translated into human experience, it reveals itself in small interactions, almost imperceptible, but which change the atmosphere around us. It is in the detail of a gesture, in the timbre of a word, in the way we enter a room that the network of connections shows itself most alive. An everyday example can illustrate this. Someone wakes up in a bad mood and starts the day speaking harshly. In a few minutes, the entire environment seems heavy, as if everyone were carrying that same tone. Conversely, a sincere smile offered early can spread almost instantly, changing the collective rhythm. These effects do not depend on long speeches, but on subtle vibrations that pass through bodies. This sensitivity is a direct expression of the invisible web that entanglement helps symbolize. By noticing these reverberations, we realize there is no neutrality in our presences. Even without intention, we emit signals that shape the shared field. This realization can generate discomfort, since it shows we are never completely isolated in our choices. However, it also offers a horizon of potential. By adjusting small attitudes, we create positive impacts that multiply in unexpected ways. Applied spirituality gains meaning in this recognition that each simple gesture participates in the construction of a collective environment. A useful practice is to observe how we feel in different spaces, enter a public place, and notice whether the body relaxes or contracts. Often, the atmosphere is marked by invisible vibrations left by previous interactions. This shows that we are not only receivers, but also collaborators in creating this field. Entanglement, translated into life, reveals that space is not neutral. It carries imprints and continuations of everything that has already happened there. This perception also applies to close relationships. Think of how a conversation can reverberate for days, even after it ends. A phrase of encouragement can strengthen someone at decisive moments, while a harsh criticism can echo as a weight for weeks. These prolonged effects are examples of how our interactions surpass immediate time, creating waves that propagate in the relational field. Entanglement suggests precisely this, the impossibility of complete separation between cause and effect, between sender and receiver. A delicate point arises when we confuse responsibility with guilt. When we realize that we constantly influence the environment, it is easy to fall into the burden of trying to control every detail. But the proposal here is not to take on excessive load, but to cultivate awareness. We do not need to monitor every gesture, but to develop sensitivity to perceive how our presences impact others. This awareness, rather than paralyzing, makes room for more aligned choices, even if imperfect. It is also important not to romanticize entanglement. Not every connection will be harmonious, nor will every reverberation be positive. Conflicts are part of life and also produce waves in the collective field. The challenge is to learn to deal with these tensions consciously, recognizing that even difficult experiences carry transformative potential. Spirituality in this case does not seek to eliminate discomfort, but to integrate it as part of the growth process. One practical way to apply this view is to try recording, at the end of the day, a moment when we clearly felt the impact of our presence or of the presences around us. It might be a quick exchange at work, an encounter on the street, or a conversation in the family. By noting not only what happened, but also how the body reacted, we begin to map the web of resonances that composes our routine. This exercise raises awareness of how we are interwoven, even in the most ordinary gestures. Entanglement, in this sense, becomes a living metaphor to remind us that reality is not made only of isolated actions, but of constant reverberations. Each choice vibrates in the collective fabric. Each word leaves marks that extend beyond the moment they were spoken. This understanding should not be seen as a burden, but as an invitation to live more awake. Recognizing the web of everyday life is recognizing that we are part of a larger process in which each thread contributes to the whole's form. In the end, what is revealed is a spirituality rooted in common life. There is no need to wait for great cosmic signs to perceive invisible connections. It is enough to pay attention to the impact we leave on others, to the way environments transform us, and to how small interactions extend into waves we do not control. Entanglement is the reminder that nothing is lost in absolute isolation. Everything resonates, everything is inscribed, everything participates in the same silent symphony that sustains us. Quantum entanglement suggests that two particles can remain bound by an invisible link, even while on opposite sides of the universe. This image, transposed into human experience, leads us to consider the value of the space between encounters. We often believe that connection exists only in direct contact, active conversation, or physical presence. However, much of the relational fabric is strengthened precisely in the intervals, in the pauses where nothing apparent happens, yet the bond remains active, sustaining a sense of belonging. It is common to notice this in long-standing friendships. Even after years apart, a reunion can unfold naturally, as if time had not erased the attunement. This phenomenon is not explained only by memory or convenience. Something remains alive in silence, a field that preserves the connection despite absence. Entanglement offers a scientific metaphor to understand this kind of invisible continuity, reminding us that connections do not need constant contact to exist. The same holds for family or emotional bonds. Often, even without direct communication, we sense when someone close is going through difficulties or significant changes. The body reacts subtly: sudden insomnia, restlessness without an apparent cause, or even an impulse to reach out. Upon later discovering that the other person was indeed experiencing something important, a feeling of confirmation arises. These episodes reinforce the idea that there is an invisible network sustaining bonds, a network that does not depend on the exchange of conventional information. In the spiritual field, this space between points is seen as fertile ground. It is where we learn to trust in something larger than linear logic. The absence of visible signs does not mean the absence of connection, but rather a different form of presence, less noisy, more subterranean. This understanding helps us deal with periods of distance without falling into the despair of separation. We recognize that the threads remain active even if we cannot perceive them immediately. This understanding can be tested in a practical way. Close your eyes and recall someone with whom you have a strong bond. Then try simply to remain in inner silence without seeking specific images or memories. Notice whether any kind of sensation arises, whether light or intense. This small exercise reveals that connection does not depend on words or actions, but can manifest in the simple act of keeping awareness open to the other. The data obtained is not scientific proof, but a subjective experience that shows the vitality of the space between encounters. However, there is a risk that must be acknowledged: the tendency to project desires onto this invisible field. Often, when waiting for signs from someone far away, we end up confusing imagination with real perception. This is where the bias check becomes essential. Asking yourself, is this sensation an objective datum of the body, or is it the product of the narrative I would like to be true, helps keep the practice anchored in honesty. The spiritual value remains, but without falling into illusions that only reinforce expectations. The space between points also teaches us about trusting the flow of life. Answers are not always immediate, nor do confirmations always arrive when we want. By recognizing that connections remain active even without external evidence, we cultivate patience and make room for the invisible network to manifest in unexpected ways. This learning strengthens our ability to deal with uncertainties and broadens our tolerance for ambiguity, essential skills for a mature spirituality. Another relevant aspect is the transformative power of this relational silence. Many internal changes happen precisely in the absence of direct stimuli. So separation can serve to reorganize feelings. An interval can allow new understandings. When the points meet again, the bond is no longer the same. It has been renewed by the very distance. Entanglement, seen through this lens, shows that connection is not static but dynamic, adapting and transforming over time. The invisible web that unites us is made of both presence and absence. What sustains bonds is not only constant exchange, but also the trust that the thread remains active even when we do not see it. This perspective broadens our view of relationships, moving us away from the need for absolute control and inviting us to trust in processes that unfold in silence. In the end, what remains is the perception that life is made not only of explicit encounters, but also of the empty spaces that connect them. Entanglement reminds us that separation is never complete. Between the points, there is always a living field sustaining the relationship. Recognizing this is to open oneself to a spirituality that embraces both presence and absence as legitimate expressions of connection. Quantum entanglement, seen through the lens of spirituality, is not merely a phenomenon distant from laboratory rooms. It becomes a living metaphor for recognizing the invisible weave that links us in every gesture, word, and silence. This connection does not require spectacular proofs, for it manifests in subtle details. In the body that reacts before the mind, in the synchronicities that illuminate decisions, in presences that continue to act even at a distance. To live with this awareness is to accept that we are not isolated fragments, but active threads in a larger web, capable of turning everyday life into a space of revelation. This perspective does not ask for blind belief, but for refined attention. Each sensation recorded, each synchronicity observed, each decision made with deep listening to the body is a way of making measurable what seemed intangible. Spirituality is strengthened precisely in this honest practice, without exaggerations or illusions, but with openness to perceive how life responds on multiple levels. Having come this far, consider taking this reflection into your own day. Notice how your gestures reverberate, how bonds remain even in silence, and how reality seems more alive when we accept its interconnected nature. And to mark that you have walked to the end of this video, write in the comments, "We are threads of the same web." If this content made sense to you and you wish to continue following reflections like this, subscribe to the channel and help keep this network of consciousness active.